Joel and Esteban, and they both are going to be talking about the importance of community. And if anyone knows community, it's these two people, because Joel started Orlando.NET User Group, and Esteban ran Orlando.NET User Group and Orlando Codecamp for over 10 years. Yep. So with that, Joel.
All right, everyone, thank you. Wow. I just have to take a moment and talk and just acknowledge the fact that in the last 3 years, this is the largest crowd that I have spoken to. So yeah, round of applause. It is amazing that this event has come back. It's amazing to see just the legacy of, everything that they built, and I'm just grateful. I'm honored to be here. So a little bit about myself, Joe Martinez. These days I'm a principal software engineering manager at Microsoft. And like he was saying, many moons ago I started the Orlando.NET User Group. It was kind of funny, I was mentioning just a little bit ago, as I was thinking about what I was going to talk about in this session, I kept thinking back, oh yeah, I started the user group in 2001. That was, 12 years ago? And I had to keep reminding myself, that wasn't 12 years ago. That was more than 12 years ago. Yeah, so, oh, there was a picture of that. Yeah, and so what I wanted to talk about today was stories, right? And one of the really sort of interesting features of stories is that as you start to study them, not only modern stories, books, movies, really anything that comes from humans, you start seeing patterns. You start seeing patterns emerge, and these are patterns that have been consistently recognized throughout the eons, since probably the beginning of time when people started telling stories. All the way back to the Iliad, all the way to today's, Disney's Frozen. You have these patterns because stories are usually based on, behaviors that people exhibit, right? And, in general, in aggregate, not always, but in aggregate, people can tend to be somewhat predictable, right? And so, why is that relevant? Because I wanted to talk about, the story that I wanted to talk about is sort of my story, which starts in the late 90s. In 1999, I was graduating high school, and I was, learning how to write software, and my plan was to enter the software industry, the tech industry. Some of the stories of the time, really sort of captured the zeitgeist. There was a lot of almost fear of how much things were changing, how technology was changing, how that was changing culture and society. And in general, the late 90s were a relatively good time. There were a lot of, it was a time of relative peace, as far as military actions around the world and things like that. Crime was going down, and in Silicon Valley, there was a lot of activity going. I remember basically that whole decade, everyone was talking about the information superhighway, right? The internet was coming. There was this promise that we were going to be able to connect and have the knowledge of the world at your fingertips, and sort of, the utopia that would bring. Jokes on that. But, again, this is the environment that I was in, and I was excited about technology. What happened in that sort of exuberance is that, a lot of companies or a lot of investors were like, hey, there's opportunities here with this internet thing. We can probably make some money if we spend money. And so, there was a whole slew of .coms, right, startups that started showing up, and they were talking, or, it was all about growth, right? And they were doing things like delivering groceries, which today is commonplace. There's like 1,000 apps on your phone that can do the same thing, but back then, it was basically insane. Terrible business, because the infrastructure wasn't there, the usage wasn't there, it just wasn't the right time. There was also, somewhat famously, there was, and I think it was pets.com, but they spent millions and millions of dollars on a Super Bowl ad. And I think that was kind of, maybe the moment that people started realizing is like, why are these businesses spending so much money with such bad business plans? And I'm sure a lot of you can imagine what comes next, the .com crash. So this happened in the year 2000, right after I graduated, and also the year that I got my first job as a software engineer, right? So I'm going into the industry in this environment where basically everything is burning to the ground. Everybody is talking about, oh my goodness, nobody's ever going to want to hire a programmer again because they're just going to spend all your money on Super Bowl ads. But thankfully, I had the, let's call it the ignorance of youth to my advantage. And I just kept going. I was just happy to be paid to do what I really enjoyed doing anyways, right? But the interesting part is that a lot of other people kept going as well. It wasn't just me. There were, obviously, there were a lot of companies that went out of business as part of the .com bust, but there were also some that survived. Some are obvious, like Microsoft and Apple, really big companies. But then there were other startups, for example, Google, that today you say alongside companies like Microsoft and Apple. And they, they survived, they thrived, and they, helped usher in sort of like this new era. Now, around this time, again, I was a young technologist, and I didn't really have a professional network to speak of, other than maybe the people that I worked with. And in 2001, Microsoft came out with some new technology, the .NET framework at the time, and it was something that I was excited about and I wanted to learn more about. And I didn't really have anyone to talk to about it because the people that I worked with weren't really interested in it. It wasn't really what we were using to work. And so I wanted to talk to people. Eventually, the opportunity came up to schedule a meeting and bring together people. To my surprise, I think it was, like 7 or 8 people showed up. We met at a Bubbaloo's Bodacious Barbecue up on Kirkland Road for that first meeting. And lo and behold, everyone was like, And they were like, yeah. And from that was what became the Orlando.net user group. And personally speaking, I can say that a lot of the people that I met in those early days, I still talk to today. I mean, personal, professional contacts. A lot of opportunities were opened, not only for myself, but other people that were involved with the user group. And so finding that community for me was, just a really big part of my career. And, sort of going back to, the overall sort of macro conditions, aside from startups like Google that had made it through the dot-com bust, you started getting these, new companies that were coming out that were, had a lot better business plans than the dot-coms. They, let's see, what are some of them? I had a list in my head. Well, okay. For one, going back to a little tiny bookseller named Amazon that was around back then. It was, I think, in 2002, and you can probably correct me if you know, but it was around 2002 when they launched Amazon Web Services, and so that was huge because it basically kicked off this era of cloud computing. And all of a sudden, when I first started, if you wanted to get something up on the web, you either had to grab a computer and physically connect it to the internet, or talk to a host that had a data center and say, hey, set up this computer here for me so I can log in and set up the web server. Like, you have to do everything yourself. And the cloud computing era just really made it so much easier for companies to start and things like that. And it kind of helped to usher in this Web 2.0 era, which was really revitalizing the industry. But throughout all that time, one of the things that I remember is that there was always this hesitation, right? Anytime things would start going well, and maybe there was an IPO or valuations would start going up, for startups in the industry, all of a sudden the articles would come out. It's like, oh, is this the new bubble? When's it gonna pop? And I think for that, in the 2000s, it almost had this era of slight conservatism and fear, where it kind of helped companies grow a little bit slower than they had during the dot-com bust. Around 2006. So I ran ONETUG, the Orlando.net user group, until around, I forget if it was 2004 or 2005. Which by that point I had an amazing group of volunteers, amazing board, and they were already planning for what became Orlando Codecamp. And I was busy. I had small children, and I just kind of had to do other things at the time. But what grew out of that, I mean, we're standing here testament to the work that all those volunteers and amazing board members did over those years. So back to just sort of the story of the industry at large. Shortly thereafter, 2007, the iPhone is launched, and as I'm sure you know, that basically kicked off. That was another huge inflection point for the industry, and it kicked off this whole mobile development sort of process or industry. And things were really starting to heat up until 2008, when there was a recession, right? But one of the interesting things about that recession, right? Everybody was like, "Oh, hey, it's here. The bubble's popping. Everything is burning to the ground again." But what happened is that kind of wasn't the tech industry's fault. banks got a little too, let's say, creative with their financial instruments, and the tech industry kind of made it through relatively unscathed compared to other parts of the economy. And the reason that that's relevant is because I think that it caused this sense of, oh, tech is untouchable. And from about 2010 on, there was just this unprecedented growth, even faster than in the run-up to the dot-com bust. Amazing growth. It's been a really wild decade. We've had, Microsoft launched Microsoft Azure, which is, our cloud, IBM Watson, and this sort of explosion of deep learning. Just these more niche areas of research that had, to a lot of people been sitting languishing for a long time. All of a sudden there was funding and interest in things like, AI, deep learning, virtual reality was able to sort of come back, and now we have some really amazing VR technology. Drones, electronics became cheaper and smaller, and enabled things like first-person, quadcopter racing, which is amazing. So it was a really amazing decade, or it has been a really amazing decade. And then 2020 happened, right? So this is, the blackest of the swans, the most unforeseeable of things, and it has really changed the world in a lot of ways. Work from home, now everybody's doing Zoom and Teams meetings. It just, nobody could have predicted that. And, it's obvious that it has caused some changes to the economy. And so, there's a lot of fear, a lot of trepidation about what's happening. We're seeing layoffs in large companies like Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Meta, and so the question then becomes, what's going to happen next, right? And of course, I don't know. If I did know, I would be a very rich person. But going back to this concept of stories and the patterns that we see, I don't think we can predict what's going to happen, but what we can do is control how we react and what we do, in these circumstances. We can seek out community, which, increase our networks. We can look at new and upcoming technology. Just a couple months ago, ChatGPT was released, and it seems like every week the pace of advancements is even faster in announcements. In a time that we're once again getting new Star Wars that's setting up what happened to the trilogy that was released before, I can't help but notice these patterns and these sort of cycles, and how they might be, relevant again. In the words of George Lucas, it's like poetry, it rhymes. So let's see what happens the next 5 years, the next decades, I think is going to be really interesting. So thank you, everyone.